means foundation. No democratically elected politician can govern without such a broad consensus. All who are elected strive to bring it about. Professor Chomsky thinks it is deceitful, but it is not. In a representative democracy, it means winning people for one's point of view. But I do not think that Professor Chomsky believes in representative democracy. I think he believes in direct democracy. With Rosa Luxemburg, he longs for the creative, spontaneous, self-correcting force of mass action. That is the vision of the anarchist. It is also a boy's dream.
Thank you, Mr. Bolkestein. One would like to hear what Professor Chomsky is going to reply on this, but the order of the debate is different. The order is that now Mr. Bolkestein replies for another 5 minutes on what Professor Chomsky has said. Do you remember what Professor Chomsky has said?
Chairman, Professor Chomsky tries to establish his thesis by the use of examples. He has posited a theory, and he says, and he tries to prove that theory by way of showing examples. Now, we all know that a theory can never be established merely by examples. It can only be established by showing some internal inherent logic. Professor Chomsky has not done so. He has confined himself to examples, and in order to refute what he says, I again must address myself to the examples he has given. The first example that I will address myself to is the Tet Offensive. Now, let me once recall the facts. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam took place in the first few months of 1968. Despite some initial and stunning successes, this offensive resulted in the defeat of the Viet Cong. And the Vietnamese have recently, for the first time, admitted that the Viet Cong was decimated as a result of the Tet Offensive. After Tet, the Viet Cong were virtually eliminated as a coherent fighting force. And thereafter, the burden of the war in the south fell more and more onto the North Vietnamese army. But the American media portrayed the Tet Offensive as a defeat for the South Vietnamese and their American allies. Professor Chomsky admits himself that the Tet Offensive has convinced much of the corporate elite in America to abandon the war efforts in South Vietnam. He himself admits that it was a turning point in the war. The biased picture which the American media drew of the Tet Offensive was therefore not without political consequences. Tran Bach Dang was the Viet Cong's commander in Saigon during the Tet Offensive. He recently said about Tet, let's put it this way: the political results were higher than we expected. Small wonder. On the 31st of March of 1968, President Johnson announced that he would not run for presidency again. So the facts are quite clear. The Tet Offensive took place in the early months of 1968. They resulted in a defeat for the Viet Cong, which was decimated as a coherent fighting force. The Vietnamese now themselves admit that, yet it was a turning point in the war. As a result, President Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. How can these two facts be reconciled? Quite simply because the picture that was drawn in America of the Viet Cong was erroneous, and of Tet was erroneous. The picture they drew was incorrect. The second example I want to quote concerns Nicaragua. Chairman, how did the American media report on the Sandinista revolution before and immediately after it took place? And how did the American government react to that? Well, now, both the Carter administration and most of the major news media took a relatively hopeful view of the Nicaraguan revolution. In November 1978, Jack Anderson wrote in the Washington Post that left-wing influence on the Sandinistas was minimal. In the same paper, Karen DeYoung wrote as follows of the decrees announced by the new Sandinista government, quote, "The laws project the new government as highly moralistic, concerned about state security, and politically liberal in a social democratic mold." In August 1979, the New York Times carried an op-ed article by Tad Schultz, which said, "Relax, Nicaragua isn't Cuba." The same month, the LA Times carried a syndicated column by Georgie Ann Gaia, quote, "Is Nicaragua inevitably to become a Cuban-style Marxist revolution?" she asked, and she answered, "Absolutely not." Should the United States, with consideration, support the Nicaraguan revolution? Absolutely yes, unquote. In September 1979, the New York Times ran an editorial that said, "So far, the revolutionary regime has shown its good faith by restoring liberties and pursuing a pluralist path." And in June 1980, the newspaper, which carries all the news that's fit to print, editorialized, "A sharp swerve to the left is always possible, but for the moment there seems a genuine commitment to pluralism at home and non-alignment abroad." And, Chairman, the point is that the financial flows reflected that reporting. Loans, credits, and grants to Nicaragua totaled $4.6 billion for the period from mid-1979 to 1986. President Carter provided $75 million of assistance, of which $60 million were disbursed. Total West European loans, credits, and grants averaged around $120 million annually over that same period. And the biggest West European donor was the Netherlands. Over the 6 years, 1980 to 1986, we gave $113 million in official development assistance. Now, what were the American media doing just before, during, and just after the Sandinista revolution? Were they furthering the interest of the American elite by portraying the Sandinistas as social democrats, full of moderation and committed to pluralism? They were not very successful. If they did, they certainly did not manage to stop those financial flows. Chairman, I want to stay with these two single issues, the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam and the way the American media portrayed the Sandinista revolution. Both examples go counter to the reasoning put forward by Professor Chomsky and disprove his thesis. And since I'm ending the end of my time, I should like to put the following three questions to Professor Chomsky. One, Professor Chomsky writes about feigned dissent, about marginal criticism. Now, what is the litmus test that enables us to distinguish between marginal and real criticism? Two, how come the US media are critical at home, yet subservient abroad? Why do they change their stripes when they cross the US borders? And three, Professor Chomsky wrote in 1979 that, quote, "Washington has become the torture and political murder capital of the world," unquote. That was printed in italics, and it was not about crack. Does he still hold that view?
Thank you very much. Professor Chomsky. May I invite you for your 5 minutes? If you want to ask these questions, it's all right. But if you want to reply on further statements,
gladly answer
the choice
You'll
is
notice
yours.
a difference in the way we approach this topic. I was discussing manufacture of consent, democracy, the possibility of survival. Mr. Bolkestein is discussing my alleged sins. For those of you who don't know the background, this is his 4th try. On each of the earlier occasions, I went through his charges one by one and showed that every one of them was a flat falsehood. Each time he has conceded that fact silently, abandoning the earlier charges and proposing new ones. He's done it again. Notice that we could concede all of that and it would be irrelevant to the topic. Let's concede that I'm a Nazi, a communist, a child molester, and so on. What does that have to do with the topic of manufacture of consent? It's zero. Simply the fact that Mr. Bolkestein talks about the feudal structures and violence in Latin America and says, quote, the gringo has nothing to do with it, namely demonstrating not only the most extraordinary historical ignorance, but apologetics for slaughter of a kind that I know of no analog to. That fact is irrelevant to manufacture of consent, which is why I did not bring up that and numerous other things which are in print. Now, Mr. Bolkestein has tried new charges. And just to show you how he uses evidence, I'll give one. If you like to talk about these things, I'll be glad to do it and respond to them in point. But notice they have nothing to do with the issue. They're an attempt to evade the issue. Just to illustrate how he uses evidence, Mr. Bolkestein claims that I hold that U.S. bombing provided Cambodians with psychological ingredients for revenge against the urban society. As he knows, that is false. It has already been demonstrated to him that it is false, but he doesn't care. That statement is by David Chandler, who's one of the leading, an American historian, who's one of the leading Cambodia scholars, expressing the consensus of scholarship, supported by U.S. government documents and analysts and so on. And we could go through it point by point in the case of Forisson and everything else. I'll do it if you like, but I'd rather keep to the topic. Mr. Bolkestein asks whether I still hold that the United States is the torture capital of the free world. Take a look at where it appears. It's in Political Economy of Human Rights, written by Edward Herman and me. We review Amnesty International reports of torture, and we show that according to Amnesty International, most of the torture in the world traces back to Washington support. That's Amnesty International's conclusion. We repeat it. And so it goes point by point. Let me now turn to the serious issues. Mr. Bolkestein says that he's quite right when he says you can't just pick examples. You have to do them in a rational way. That's why we compared examples. So, for example, he likes to avoid this. We didn't discuss Cambodia. We compared Cambodia with East Timor, two very closely paired examples. Two major atrocities, comparable evidence, same scale, same part of the world, evidence at least as adequate in the case of Timor as in Cambodia, and we gave approximately 300 pages of detail covering this in Political Economy of Human Rights, including a reference to every article we could discover about Cambodia and every article we could discover about East Timor. The second was quite easy because as the atrocities mounted, the coverage dropped, reaching zero as the atrocities reached their peak and American support increased. Now, notice the issue. The atrocities in East Timor could continue because the United States was increasing the flow of arms to Indonesia. As the arms increased, the coverage decreased. Take Cambodia. There's an apparent difference of opinion on the conclusions because they were looking at different facts. The total number of articles we listed, in fact. You don't have to go to his sources because we listed them. There weren't many articles because there was virtually no evidence. But in 1975, 3 weeks after the Khmer Rouge took power, the New York Times accused them of genocide. At that point, there were a few hundred, maybe a few thousand killed. Within a year, they had been accused of genocide in the Reader's Digest, in massive article, a lead article in the Reader's Digest, readership 50 million. TV Guide, second largest journal, readership 20 million. The New York Review of Books for the intellectuals accused them of auto-genocide on the basis of totally falsified evidence, as the author quietly conceded. We go through a case after case, and what we show is massive outrage. There was some evidence suppressed. In fact, what was suppressed was the evidence from the only source that had any information, namely U.S. intelligence. It was suppressed because the figures weren't high enough. We demonstrate a record of deceit which would have impressed Stalin. If you don't believe it, take a look at the documentation. The comparison is to East Timor, where we could have stopped it, remember, because we were increasing the armaments as the comparable atrocities increased. That's what's called serious analysis, not picking examples out of a hat. Of the other examples that Mr. Bolkestein studies, I'm surprised at the choice, because many of them are examples we discussed. For example, Burundi was an example we discussed as demonstrating our model. There were no U.S. elite interests involved. It was therefore not mentioned. As to Watergate, of course we discussed Watergate and we again did a comparison. History arranged a beautiful paired controlled experiment for us at that time. The Watergate exposures appeared precisely at the moment that the FBI COINTELPRO operations appeared. These were efforts by the National Political Police to stir up violence in the ghetto. They included political assassination and so on. One of the minor parts of the COINTELPRO was the revelation that for 15 years the FBI had been burglarizing the offices of a legal political party, a small legal political party, the Socialist Workers' Party, stealing its records, using them to defame members and put the party out of existence. Now, what was Watergate? Watergate wasn't a fraction of that footnote. Watergate was a break-in into the Democratic Party headquarters by a group of crooks for no known reason. The one that was revealed at the same time was the effort but through 3 administrations by the National Political Police to destroy a legal political party. And recall, that was a footnote to COINTELPRO.
May I please interrupt you?
Yes.
According to the schedule, you have now 7.5 minutes with interruptions, possible interruptions, which in principle still means that only one person is speaking at the same time.
Who is going on?
You, please, for 7.5
I am going on, or? I don't understand this interruptions business. You'll have to explain it to me. I know how to talk and I know how to listen, but I don't know how to interrupt. So.
If Mr. Bolkestein wants to come in, he is allowed to.
Now, who's talking? Who is supposed to be talking?
You.
I talk, he interrupts.
You are
That's
talking.
The idea. Okay, that's fine. Then let me then finish the thought about Watergate. Why was Watergate a huge issue and the break-in of the Socialist Workers' Party a zero issue, and the FBI operations to foment violence in the ghetto, of which they were very proud, etc., also a zero issue? Answer very simple. The Democratic Party represents established power. In fact, it represents half of the business power in the United States. Powerful people know how to defend themselves when they're attacked. The issue in Watergate was very simple. People with power will defend themselves. People without power can't. That's the total issue in Watergate. Well, let me go on. Let's take the case of Israel. Mr. Bolkestein says that there was a charge that 600,000 people were displaced in an area with 500,000 people. According to the Israeli government, there are 1 million people living in that area. That's been repeated in article after article in the Hebrew press. You can look at my books for documentation. As for the 600,000, that was given by the Red Cross, reduced by the Red Cross to 300,000, at which point the media repeated the 300,000. The invasion of Lebanon which was supported by the United States officially. The United States kept providing arms, vetoing resolutions at the UN to stop the slaughter and so on. The New York Times described it as the liberation of Lebanon. Lebanese opinion was totally excluded. The Democrats supported it even more than the Republicans, I should say. All of this is documented in my book, to which it described. According to the Lebanese police and the Lebanese government, which Israel installed, there were 20,000 people killed. The Israeli press, which I review in detail, gave much harsher analyses than the American press did. As for Beitar being a fascist-style organization, of course I said it. I was quoting David Ben-Gurion, and I also gave his evidence for it, quoting Beitar documents which describe it as a fascist organization. As for the, let me go on with the, let's take the Hue massacre. That's, so notice the way Mr. Bolkestein describes it, the way he describes Cambodia, avoiding the paired example, right? Which is why we brought it up, of course. There were 2 Hue massacres. We also discussed that in our book. According to Western sources, about 4,000 people were killed in the U.S. bombing of Hue as they attempted to reconquer the city from the Viet Cong, who he failed to tell us are South Vietnamese. According to the same U.S. government sources, 2,800 people were killed by the communists during the reconquest, the U.S. reconquest of Hue. So there are 2 Hue massacres. Notice the one that the press focused on and that he repeats.
Chairman, may I come in on this
yes,
point? The reason that I raised the matter of the Hue massacre was not in order to prove or to say that either one side or the other had perpetrated this massacre. It was merely to ask the question why Miss McCarthy preferred to think that her own country